Thank you all for being here. There's more chairs that are going to come out here, and those of you who just got here, please have some lunch. I'd like to thank Kiki Sadurni, most of all, for the inspiration to put this together, a collaboration between the Mental Health Master's Counseling Program and the Professional Development Sequence, and the Center for Human Rights, and also recognize Dan Canstrom, who's here, the interim director of the center, and also a number of other members of the BC faculty, Dr. Deborah Levinson, Dr. Stephen Souls, Alexandra Piñeros Shields, who's here from MIRA, and other experts who I'm not going to be able to name everybody, but most of all to the students who are here, because this is an opportunity for me not only to share some of my work, but to think about my work in relationship to the legacy of a colleague, a friend, a mentor who was killed 24 years ago this week in El Salvador. So I'm going to start with, after thanking all you wonderful people, and also to Penny and Nettie for putting this together. I want to sort of situate the work in the context of a lot of psychological work, some of which many of you have been involved in. Marianne Lockery is here, visiting scholar at the center and affiliated with the School of Social Work. And she has been involved in humanitarian crises and environmental disasters, as well as was on the committee that put together the Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on mental health and psychosocial support. This is just a quick pass-through for those psychologists in the audience of the ways in which psychologists have multiplied their influence and engagement over the last 20 or 30 years in a wide range of contexts that are characterized, broadly speaking, by violations of human rights. In addition to the work in humanitarian crises and disasters, psychologists and psychiatrists have contributed importantly to working with survivors of torture, disappearances, and other gross violations of human rights. The ways in which that has happened are widely known in the United States, with work with Vietnam veterans and also survivors of sexual violence through the diagnostic category of post-traumatic stress disorder, which, as much work in the social sciences, has generated a lot of critique and rethinking and sort of pushing the boundaries, particularly by people working in the southern hemisphere. David Becker and his colleagues in Chile, who talk about extreme traumatization, highlighting that when you live in a zone of armed conflict and ongoing war, the trauma that you experience is not post, but rather ongoing. Gillian Straker, a South African who worked for many years in South Africa and now lives in Australia, generated the notion of complex post-traumatic stress disorder, in which she and her colleagues tried to look at economic injustices, political injustice in the apartheid regime in South Africa, and then horizontal violences that take place within communities that are both perpetrators and victims. The Peace and Conflict Journal has recently published a special issue looking at this idea of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And then the work of Simone Lindefer, who is a German living now in Austria, who's worked a lot in East Africa, who has helped us think about what are the limits of liberation, and particularly the work of Ignacio Martín-Baró. And perhaps better known in this area because of the work of Herb Kelman at Harvard University and in the Middle East. But also, I'll just point you to a couple of other examples: Ed Cairns in Northern Ireland, Erwin Staub in Rwanda, and the work of John Paul Lederach, who has done an enormous amount of work trying to bring together sensitivities to cultural dimensions with sensitivities to gross violations of human rights, and works in the tradition of the Quakers. And then finally, psychologists who work in peace building and peacemaking. Much of this work was generated during the lifetime of Ignacio Martín-Baró and after Martín-Baró, not the early work of Vietnam veterans, but the other work. So what I want to try and do today is talk about, well, what was his contribution and where has his contribution gone, and in what ways has it influenced this work, and in what ways is the challenge of how it might influence this work still before the next generation of you, that is, those of you studying today. So I'm going to briefly introduce you to some key moments in his life and his work. I want to explore what I consider to be his legacy vis-a-vis psychological theory and practice, and that will touch upon the notion of liberation psychology, what he called psychosocial work, and I'm going to call psychosocial accompaniment, or being alongside survivors of war and gross violations of human rights. And then some of the interventions that I think have evolved that challenge the systemic causes of structural inequity, those being economic, racialized, or gendered, while trying to foster what some of us are calling transformative praxis, but recognizing the ongoing context of gendered and racialized violence in the world. So, as some of you know, Ignacio Martín-Baró, or Nacho as he was known to many of his friends and colleagues, was born on November the 7th in 1942 in northwestern Spain. He was the fourth of 6 children. He entered the religious order of the Society of Jesus at the age of 17. That's not so common anymore, but in the area of Spain from which he came, it was quite common, and he had 2 siblings who also entered religious life shortly before and after him. But he completed his training as a Jesuit not in Spain, but rather in El Salvador, and then was sent to Bogota, Colombia, where he studied philosophy, and later to Europe in Belgium, where he studied theology, before returning to San Salvador to complete his first degree in psychology. That is, his first degree in psychology was completed after his studies in theology and philosophy. In 1975, he traveled to the University of Chicago, where he did a master's and a doctorate in social and organizational psychology. In addition to excelling at his studies, his adolescent talents were of a magician, and he spent many years entertaining children at birthday parties and other areas, and he carried that sense of humor with him throughout his life, as those of us who knew him can attest. This lighter side was noted not only by Salvadoran peasants, but also by psychologists who had the good fortune to work with him. And combined with his guitar and his great voice, he was the life of many late-night parties and activities. I know most of you think I don't know such things, but with him I did have some opportunity to share in those activities, both here in Boston, in Argentina, and in other parts of Latin America, including Cuba. So Ignacio had the capacity to reflexively situate himself as a psychologist. That is, to think about the challenges of psychology as he had experienced them, and then to think about his history within El Salvador and the political and social context within El Salvador. And he offered us, as psychologists, a framework, particularly a framework through which those of us who are trained in Euro-American, or what's often referred to as Western psychology, I'm not sure that that's a good name for it, but in the Northern Hemisphere, in the United States, and or in Europe, so that we might also think critically about our own power and our own privileges vis-a-vis those with whom many of us engage in research and or direct service. Secondly, he urged us to understand the social situatedness of our praxis and to think about it within its historical, economic, and political systems of power. And then, in keeping with some of the work that had been initiated in Chile by Elizabeth Lira and her colleagues, a very innovative idea for psychologists, particularly clinicians in this period of history, we're talking about the 1970s and early 1980s, that psychologists had to take a non-neutral position, both as social scientists and also as clinicians. That is, neutrality was not an option, particularly not an option if you're working in a war zone, and not an option if you're working with people whose human rights have been violated. He acknowledged that he was one of a very small number of the 700-plus psychologists in El Salvador in the 1980s who challenged the status quo, arguing that those of us who do challenge the status quo are forced to seek new models and different approaches to our work. And so, among the different approaches to our work that he articulated while visiting here in Boston,
cannot be solved at the individual level. They need to be addressed both at the psychic and at the social level, at the individual and at the collective level.
He sought to put our focus at that complex interface between the individual and the social system and social structure. There have been numbers of theories that have been developed in developmental psychology and social psychology to acknowledge that, quote unquote, no person is an island, that we are embedded in a series of systems and structures. But the fact is that psychology, more than other disciplines, tends to focus our attention to the individual tends to look at the individual and see the context as having an influence, but is not very skilled at developing theories and models that think dialectically as to how the individual influences these various levels and how those levels influence them. So he offered us several ideas about how to think about these issues. The first of which is to think about action and ideology, or basic assumptions, or basic beliefs, or unquestioned beliefs. And for him, the individual and society are mutually constitutive of human action. And this focus on human action, which comes out of, for those of you who study cognitive psychology and the work of Vygotsky from the Soviet Union, think of activity. And you can think of some of this notion of human action as having some roots in that notion. But that action is shaped by and shaping up social forces, in particular historical settings. Ali Ghazi is here, and he's taught these ideas in history of psychology for many years, and now is teaching them in political science. But there are very few psychologists who have a deep sense of history and a deep sense of the importance of history. And I would argue those of us who were born and raised in the United States also really don't have a very strong historical sense of our country and of our country's role, not just here in terms of what it guarantees for those of us who are citizens, but also our role in the larger world. So for him, the history of psychology, and particularly in his case, social psychology, was important, and it stressed social constructionism, Marxist approaches to understanding the social order, and the political role of social psychology. That social psychology was a part of politics and political movements. Erica Berman from England has tried to do the same thing using critical analyses of developmental psychology. And there are other psychologists who have developed this critical perspective. It's not widely taught within the United States, despite the fact that it is widely taught in Europe and in other countries of the orbit who have been influenced by the British educational system. And then thirdly, he focused his work on power. That is, a critique of social interest underlying psychology, similar to the work of Erica Berman. She looks at the work of Grothendiener and attachment theories and looks at what was going on socially in the world around children and child development as these theories emerged. And what's the parallel structures of power as it's circulating in social scientific and in broader communities, and how do they inform that work? So he was a prolific lecturer. Many people wonder when he could have possibly written. He really was only in the profession as a PhD for 9 years. He published these 2 books that are widely used in teaching social psychology. I'll send them around, just be sure they get back to me. This one's called Group Processes and Power, and this one's called Action and Ideology. So what he tried to do here was to think about the dominant theories in social psychology as they've emerged in Euro-American psychology, what to be drawn from them, and then how does one push forward from them to respond to what was at that point an armed conflict in El Salvador, an armed conflict in which the United States was deeply, deeply involved. It was in that context, and particularly pushed by the challenges of what was going on as more and more people were being killed in El Salvador, that he pressed forward to try and articulate what he called in 1 or 2 places, and what others have called since then, what a liberation psychology might look like. And what he had in mind, at least 3 things, there are many others, but just to give a brief introduction to it, that is the need for Latin American psychology to focus on what he called the needs of the majority population, rather than on its scientific and social status. He suggested that the liberation of an individual person was deeply interconnected with that of El Pueblo, or the entire population, and that that's central to the work of liberation. Secondly, he argued that we needed a new epistemology, or theory of knowledge, that the truth of the popular majority must be constructed from below, that the oppressed build the truth of the Latin American people. He took some of these ideas from liberation theology, and particularly from this notion of the preferential option for the poor. So what he's suggesting is, unlike a lot of psychological theory that was built on empirical research, where the participants in that research were drawn from universities, particularly universities that were, in that period of history, populated by white, middle and upper middle class, predominantly students, and then we developed theories which we argued were universal, that is, that applied to all people, that we could talk about self-esteem or achievement motivation or a whole host of other characteristics. He said, these are very interesting. Some of this might be useful to us, but truly I think what we have to figure out is how do we listen to the base? How do we listen to the wider population? And how do we develop knowledge from that wider population? A very challenging set of issues, but one in which he developed some methodological skills while at the University of Chicago. But in general, these three tasks were what he put before us as a challenge. One, we need to recover historical memory, and that has become all the more acute for these countries as they've emerged from armed conflict and are transitioning into, they hope, democratic processes. The second is a word which is a mouthful, and you trip over it in English or in Spanish, but de-ideologizing everyday experience. That is, looking at everyday experience, those things that we take for granted in our everyday lives, and realizing that they're built into a set of assumptions or a set of ideological presuppositions that may or may not reflect those everyday experiences, which means we need to be constantly deconstructing as we're constructing. And then he argues that we have to utilize people's virtues. And I think that sort of dovetails or interfaces with what has become an important commitment of counseling psychology and also of developmental psychology, which is not to pathologize people, but to think about people's resources, people's resilience, people's capacities. That is not to say that people are not wounded. Henry Nouwen, a theologian, referred to people who work in war zones as wounded healers. That is, they work trying to accompany people, but they themselves carry the wounds of living in war zones. If you have any doubts about that, think about what you're hearing on the radio today in the wake of the typhoon in the Philippines and the enormous damage there. So one of, for me, his key points here in thinking about mental health and in thinking about the contributions of those who work in the counseling field and in community psychology is that mental health, he argued, is a dimension of the relations between persons and groups more than an individual state. Even though this dimension may take root differently in the body of each of the individuals, thereby producing a diversity of manifestations, or what psychologists typically call symptoms, and or states or syndromes. That is, he's not saying that as individuals we are marked differently by the experiences we have. But he is saying that we want to emphasize the importance of changing a lens and seeing mental health or illness not as a result of an individual's internal functioning, but as a manifestation in a person or a group of the humanizing or alienating character of historical relationships. It cannot be satisfied treating post-traumatic stress. We need for that treatment to address itself to relationships between and among social groups, which constitute, and he is often quoted for this, what has become the normal abnormality that dehumanizes the oppressor and the oppressed, the soldier and the victim, the dominator and the dominated. So war zones polarize social relationships, they polarize groups, and people are either perpetrators or victims, and he's arguing that all people are deeply wounded by these experiences. For those of you who have participated with me or otherwise in the Undoing Racism workshops that are hosted by the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, you'll recognize this idea that both perpetrators and victims are deeply wounded by structures and systems of injustice. And so for him, that was a critical piece of it. So as we try and rethink how does psychology think about these issues and how did Martin-Baro think about them, we draw upon some theories that have emerged in this context of the majority world, the global south, the southern cone, however you want to think about people that worked on these issues and in these realities. He was in contact with the work of Argentines and Chileans who were responding to survivors of torture, disappearances, and the dictatorships in their countries. He was in touch with people in Guatemala and in other parts of the Andean regions where ongoing armed conflict. And so some of these ideas include a term which is also taken up in the work of Arthur Kleinman, who's a psychiatrist locally and also an anthropologist, this idea of social suffering. That is, the suffering in the world does not reside only in the individual, but it results in our interpersonal and systemic relationships. He coined the phrase psychosocial trauma. He took the notion of trauma not as something residing in the individual, but residing in psychosocial relationships, the ways in which we interact with each other, but also mark us psychologically. Argentine and Chilean psychiatrists and psychologists talked about the ways in which war polarizes individuals and fractures memories. The denial, for example, that your family member has disappeared when you go to the military to report that that person has disappeared, splits. It causes a fracture. And those fractures have been worked with in the individual psychological and psychiatric community. But he also suggests we need to think about this in the social arena. What's being fractured in the social arena when truth of what the military is doing is being denied to the public? And then altered frozen's grief, which is the grief which one lives in when one doesn't know whether one's family member has been killed or has disappeared and alive someplace. And it's this tension that one exists in, on the one hand wanting to think the person's dead because not wanting to believe the kind of torture that the person could be experiencing if they were alive, on the other hand not wanting the family member to be alive. And this is particularly acute in children. So what are the different ways in which he tried to work with these realities and work with these issues? One which I think is super innovative and super interesting is to take a simple resource which he learned about and studied at the University of Chicago, a survey. But rather than survey the the Salvadoran elite, or rather than survey students at the university, the Jesuit university where he's teaching, he said, I'm going to take the survey out into the campo, out into rural areas, and we're going to survey people who don't know how to read and write. We're going to train a group of students, and we're going to go out and we're going to learn what they think about the war. So in the context of an armed conflict, when the discourse that was being presented to the world was a discourse of resisting communism and of protecting El Salvador from being taken over by communists, a discourse that was fed by millions and millions of tax dollars from the United States, he said, let's find out what peasants think of this. And then he began to publish that work. So for him, the survey was a resource to subvert what he called the institutional lies propagated by Salvadoran and U.S. governments by documenting opinion from the bottom up. His work as a surveyor was one that rendered the experiences of the majority that then became central to how Salvadoran people understood what their government was about. And he argued that through people's knowledge, we're able to challenge one of the objectives of psychological warfare, that is, the systematic attack on the survivor's ability to distinguish what is true from what is not true. Ramsey Lehman and I wrote an article many years ago about this idea, which is if you can't tell whether what you think is what really happened, because the people in your social context are telling you it's not what really happened, but you are sure that that is what happened, it's impossible to proceed. So by documenting the ideas of the majority, he was able to put that into a critically important context and to send that information to the wider.
El Salvador, 1989. More than 800 people killed since Saturday. Among them, 6 Jesuit priests dragged from their beds, tortured and murdered overnight.
And that was one consequence of the witness and the message and the work that he did. Ignacio Martín-Baró was killed alongside Ignacio Echecorria, who was the head of the University of Central America in El Salvador at that time. And he was the target of this attack because he had been working as a negotiator between the military and the guerrilla forces and pressing for a peace. And the order was to leave no witnesses behind. So not only were the other Jesuits who lived in this home killed, but so was their housekeeper and so was her 15-year-old daughter. The Jesuits have pursued this case aggressively and avidly with the help of lawyers here in the United States, lawyers in Spain, and there have been a variety of twists and turns in the case. That would be for another talk. But it's also critically important to say that he was one of 12,000 people killed during this armed conflict because he was a Jesuit priest, because they were very important people in El Salvador at the time. They were able to galvanize public opinion to move organizations, including the American Psychological Association, I might add, to take positions in protest to what was going on in El Salvador. They weren't able to cut off the funding for the war in El Salvador. So what's the legacy of this, and how do we think about the messages and how do we think about the ideas that Martin-Baro put forward. So with really a lot of self-consciousness and a lot of humility, I want to try and suggest a few ways in which I've tried to put these ideas together. As some of you know, and as you heard from Penny, I've worked in zones of armed conflict in Central America, in South Africa, and the north of Ireland, but mostly in Guatemala and in rural Guatemala in the highlands with Mayan communities. And I've also recently worked in my native New Orleans in the post-Katrina context, and also am working with many of you in the room in a migration and human rights project here in the United States, in which many of the people we're working with were young children during the war in Guatemala, and they're now living as unauthorized migrants here in the United States. Complex social realities and complex violence. I also started my academic journey having spent a year in France, during which I was able to study Marxist theory and also participate in a number of social movements that were very much a part of Catholicism at that period of time, and landed then at Harvard Divinity School, where I did a master's degree and was exposed to Latin American liberation theology. So I come by some of these ideas through that trajectory. But when I encountered Ignacio Martín-Baró, it was an opportunity for the first time for me to meet someone more or less my age. I mean, he's a bit older than me, but not so much older than me, who was trying to thread together some things, but from a very different social location. And together we, with Chileans and Argentines, put together a 4-country project. He was killed before that happened, but this is the book that came out of that process, in which we tried to look at the impact of these experiences on children in Guatemala and El Salvador, and on youth in Chile and Argentina, and in which we tried to explore the contributions of creative techniques, which I'll tell you a little more about. But before I do that, I want to take a lesson from his book and just do a little bit of critical reflexivity, because this, I think, is really important for knowing who I am. Obviously, I'm white. I'm also privileged, and I'm also really highly educated. Highly educated vis-a-vis the rest of my family, and highly educated vis-a-vis the United States population. And I also benefit from what I and my colleague Alison Crosby have called the hegemonic power of Northern academics. That is, we in the North think we can know the colonized other in the global South. And we think we can know them through our research, through our accompaniment processes. And I think the only way I can approximate understanding the realities of many of the populations that I've just talked about is if I deconstruct my power and my privilege, and if I think critically about the systems of power and privilege that are a part of my everyday life here in the United States. And that's a lifelong process, because I benefit from them. I live in this comfort of Boston College. So reflexivity is a resource that psychologists and other social sciences have developed to help those of us who are outsiders critically think about our privilege and to locate that privilege in a series of theories and actions that inform how we do. So for me, I have to constantly seek to reposition myself by problematizing my encounter as a Euro-American with, and the colonized others, not just in Guatemala, it's right here in the United States. It's kids who grow up in working class communities. It's men in Roxbury who have a higher chance of landing in jail than they do of going to college. I have to continuously and critically interrogate how I benefit from systemic privileges. That's not telling my life story. I'm not going to stand here and tell you about my life. I don't think it's that interesting. But it is that I have to be critically engaged in that process. And I have to contest circulations and interlocking relations of power that include gender oppression, which oppresses me as a woman in many contexts, certainly did at Harvard Divinity School. Racism, from which I am privileged as a white person. Classism, from which I am also privileged as someone who has a huge salary as a faculty member here at Boston College. I know for many faculty it doesn't feel huge, but relative to the rest of the world, it's massive. And ableism. Someone told me recently that I'm temporarily able. I'm happy to report that I'm still temporarily able. But all of us are going to land someplace where we're not going to be. And that's critically important as we think about this work with survivors. So, how have I put this together in the wake of Ignacio's death? Well, I cried a lot. I wrote him lots of letters. I spent a lot of time in El Salvador. And out of that process, I also reflected a lot on what it's like to be a woman in the midst of all of this in a context where there weren't a lot of people thinking about gender issues. And so I took some of the work from other feminists, and I just want to point out a couple of things here. One is this notion of just enough trust and safe enough spaces. The idea of just enough trust comes from a researcher who was at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, a woman who did the first feminist participatory action research study. And she talked about the fact that when you're working across chasms of power, where some people bring a whole set of resources and other people don't have it, researchers often talk about we have to build trust. And she said, well, you know what? Trust needs to be recognized as situational and historical. And just enough trust to be able to collaborate, but it's not trust in any abstract, absolute sense. That there's plenty of reasons for people not to trust me, and particularly coming from the United States, moving into a war zone where the United States was funding that war against rural populations. That was really important for me to remember. So those are the different ways in which I've tried to engage that work, and these are some of the communities in which I've worked. One day I'm going to be able to talk across these experiences and pull out what I've learned thinking across them. I'm not there yet, and I've learned the hard way trying to jam in 2 or 3 of them into a single public presentation means you don't get much out of any of it. So I'm going to focus on one area in which I've been working for a long time, and that's with rural Mayan women in mountainous areas of Guatemala. And if you have questions about some of the other work, I'm more than happy to answer them. So what's the theoretical and methodological resources that I've drawn on? This is really important because sometimes people think if you do participatory and action research, you just suspend everything that you know and you go live in communities and you together generate knowledge. Well, some people may do it that way, but I've never been able to suspend what I know. So mostly what I want to do is know what I know and what I don't know, and think critically about that. So some of where I come from in this process is I'm quite deeply drawn to deconstructing this notion of PTSD. I think if you train in clinical and counseling psychology, you've got to learn how these systems were designed, what they're designed for, and you have to be able to use them, because if you can't, then people in this country can't get health care. But the challenge for me is, once you position yourself vis-a-vis your understanding of power and systems of marginalization and disenfranchisement, how do you use the systems on behalf of the people with whom you're working, and how do you contest them and develop new ways of thinking about them that are collective, social, and rooted in an understanding of colonization. Colonization in this country and colonization of the U.S. and other parts of the world. And so part of how I've done that is through something called Feminist or Feminist-infused participatory action research, and taking an idea from the work of an Indian philosopher named Raimundo Panikar, who said to me once many years ago in a group of 100 people, so it wasn't he said it right to me, but it really struck me as something super important. In order to understand, we have to stand under the experiences of people. That is, we have to flip that term, take it in half, and think about what does it mean to look from the base of experiences. And I just this weekend read an incredibly provocative article by a British, I think he's a psychologist, Marianne, or is he a psychiatrist, Derek Sommerfeld, who's known in the field as very critical of the concept of post-traumatic stress disorder. But he gave a lot of citations from people like the people who are still alive in the Philippines about what their daily lives are like. And it just highlighted for me again how absolutely impossible it is for a person who's in this environment day in and day out to truly understand the psychological well-being or lack of well-being of someone in that environment. So standing under, I think, is a really important thing. And then we're going to talk a little bit about what Stacy Razak and others have called the hyper-visibility of rape and war. That is, how do we go from rape and war having been something that was invisible to the human rights community to it becoming something that is what she calls hyper-visible. That is, that's how we look at women who have survived war. We reduce their complex realities to rape survivors. And then the whole question of how do we situate ourselves as what Alison Crosby and I call intermediaries. So I just said how important history is, so here's a little history of my involvement in Guatemala. Actually, it's not my whole involvement, because I actually started out in Guatemala in Mexico with Mayan refugees, but in 1992, in the 1980s, while the war was still going on, in 1992 I got invited to go up to this village in northern Quiche called Chahul, and to do something they called a mental health workshop. And there I met a small group of women who wanted to build a corn mill and wanted to develop a women's organization. Now, I was a psychologist. Fortunately for me, I already had tenure in a state university, so I didn't have to pump out research every month. And I said, build a corn mill. I know nothing about that. I said, start a women's organization. Well, I coordinated a women's studies program for 4 years. I've started 4 different organizations over the last 10 years. I know how to do that. Not in Guatemala, I might add, but I thought I could help them do the part of it that has to do with organizing locally, and then I need to find somebody who knows how to work their way through the Guatemalan government's bureaucracy and actually become an organization. So we did that for a few years, and through that process I began to understand a little bit about the population and what it had survived. This is an area of Guatemala in which there have been 3/4 of the 600 massacres that took place in over 600 that took place in the country or in the northern Quiche region. There's not a family that wasn't affected by this. And the women had gathered together and wanted to start this organization where people who had been in refugee camps in Mexico, people who had been hiding under their beds in their town, people who had been in the guerrilla, people whose husbands were in the military, and people who were displaced internally in Guatemala City. So I brought this book done by after I'd been working with them for 4 years, and I was increasingly curious as to why they weren't participating in these truth and reconciliation processes that had evolved in the country. I brought a book that had been done by a woman named Caroline Wang, a public health worker in rural China using photographs, and I had been doing a lot of creative workshops with them. We decided to do a book together and to work on this project over many years. And I spent the following 24 almost years I've spent on and off working in this community. Most recently, however, I joined Alison Crosby from York University and Brandon Hammer from South Africa, who's now at the University of Ulster, in a project which tried to identify 8 different initiatives around the world that were alternatives to post-traumatic stress disorder for doing community-based interventions in context of war or post-conflict transitions out of violence. And in that process, we had an opportunity to document some of what was going on in Guatemala and then to engage in conversations with people about what was going on in other parts of the world. So we decided I'd go back to Chahul and I would try to understand from women there what they thought they had learned from the workshops that we had done over many years, both mental health workshops and also then this book project. And then we worked with an organization in Guatemala named Ramhe that had been working with a group of 54 women who self-identified as survivors of sexual violence in armed conflict. And in that context, we did a participatory action research project exploring women's understandings of the impact of participatory workshops using creativity. And I just want to tell you a little bit about that work and a little bit about what we found. Because this is an example of how to work in a participatory fashion with people at the base to understand knowledge from the bottom up. So I'm going to refer to these women, just for shortening the conversation, as Group 1 and Group 2. Group 1 being 20 of the 160 women who were in this participatory, in this women's organization, started by 6 people but grew to be 120. And they're the 20 women who joined together to do this project, this photo voice project, which I'll send around, telling the story of war from their point of view using photography. So that we used role-playing, dramatic play theater. We also used drawing and verbal storytelling techniques. And then they brought their own cosmovision, their own understanding of Mayan history, and also their understanding of evangelical Christianity and of Catholicism, because people came from a variety of different religious traditions. And the second group was a subset of people from this group of 54 women. A major difference between these two groups was the following. These women had been identified through a series of workshops that took place throughout the Guatemalan highlands as women who wanted to talk about their experiences of having been raped during war, but as women who were afraid to talk about those experiences within their own villages because they were afraid either that their current partners would further stigmatize them, that the men who raped them, who were still living in the community, would further abuse them, that the children born of that rape, who they had never told that they were born of a rape, would find out through this process. So the psychologists, the feminists, and the other eventually lawyers who worked with these women offered workshops, but in a neutral space. So women came from 4 different ethnic groups. They were the Chu, the Kekchi, the Kapachikel, and the Mam. The women I worked with were the Ishio and the Kiche. And they came for workshops, but we used many of the same techniques. That is, creativity, drama, murals, theater. They also developed a radio series, and they also participated in a workshop that was facilitated by the Peruvian theater group Rigashkani. Their participatory workshops also emphasize embodiment, and they lived the experiences of tensions between the feminist orientation, their Mayan traditions, and the psychosocial approach, because the discourse of the women who organized this was that of feminism. That is, although I identify myself as a feminist, I never brought that discourse into the local project that I was working with. These women did. So the 2 main differences were different ethnic groups, but also my work in Chihuahua was in the town and in the villages that it was locally, geographically based. This work was in what became known by the women and identified by the women themselves as women's community. So we participated in a series of creative workshops. Here's some of the resources we used: collage, collective drawings, photography, mapping exercises, the photo voice process, embodied practices of ritual, role-playing, dramatization, and dramatic multiplications, oral histories, life stories, narratives, testimony, and the Mayan cosmovision, which was brought in by them, not by us. And this is critically important because those of us from outside of Mayan communities have often been, I think, somewhat legitimately accused of sort of taking from the Mayan cosmovision and then turning it into something that we think is the Mayan cosmovision and then injecting it into our workshops. I think the intention is good. That is, we recognize that it's an important set of assumptions and beliefs. But the reality is that we sometimes distort these intentions and beliefs. And then the other reality is, even though many Mayan people refer to the Mayan cosmovision, there's no such thing as the Mayan cosmovision. Beliefs change over time and they develop in dynamic ways. And that's really a critically important thing. So we combine these strategies through these creative workshops. We always started with some kind of a ritual that the women themselves put together. We then did some sort of a participatory drawing, brainstorming creative techniques. They were asked to select a technique that they felt best communicated something that they had learned over time. And then we engaged, that is myself and Alison Crosby and a couple of women from this process, in thinking about how to analyze this data, that is transcribe it and try and thematically code it. So the process went through 4 levels: the workshops, the analyses, and the feedback with them of the thematic content, and then using a more constructivist grounded theory analysis, because we did interviews with all the people who had facilitated this work in both contexts over many years. We also did interviews with people that were in the heads of the state-led processes for truth and reparations processes in Guatemala to try and see how those programs interface with what is going on the ground. And then we try to develop popular education pamphlets and web-based presentations of our findings, and we're now putting them into multiple Mayan languages. We, in this case, in that particular case, is Mount Hay, the organization in Guatemala with whom we're working. So just a few ideas. There's lots and lots and lots of other things. But the women were asked to do drawings of themselves during the armed conflict, and this is how some of the women up in Champul and in their villages represented themselves. The left is an individual drawing that was done by a woman who was of the 20 women in this photo voice project that you'll see that's coming around. The one on the right is a drawing that was done by a village, a group of 30 women who lived in a village. They were broken into 5 different groups, and they did collective drawings. And that's their image of the armed conflict. That is, they were asked to draw a sense of themselves before these creative techniques and these workshops came to their village or came to their town. And then later they were asked to do it afterwards. Notable in this picture, and these are communities where people didn't talk about sexual violence openly, when they described this picture, they talked about the river, they talked about how the soldiers raped the women, how they cut them into pieces, and how they threw them into the river. So this conversation about rape was beginning. These drawings have been done, similar drawings have been done over decades in the way before, and they're done in many parts of the world. But the actual situating of women in the drawing and the situating of rape was a first in this context. Because I've been up there over many years, I can observe that difference. From someone from the outside, it doesn't seem like a very, and I'll talk in a minute about what people think of as a good rape survivor and a bad rape survivor. These women are considered to be bad rape survivors because they haven't really internalized the experience and haven't worked through language. This, though, is a very interesting drawing. Many people use trees, flowers to draw themselves rather than, it's a very clever way, actually. When somebody asks you to draw yourself and you whine and say, I don't know how to draw, which I do. And someone says, draw yourself. They draw flowers or trees or something that represents them because they experience themselves to be a part of nature and of nature. But what's really interesting about this is the war, this is the negativity, and it's brown. I don't know if you can see it. These are tears. But this woman talked a lot about the lessons she learned in the war. She was a part of the communities of populations in resistance. She fled her town. She fled with 4 children who were raised in mountainous regions where they fled bombings repeatedly for 7 years. And yet she saw good things that she had learned in that process. Ignacio Martín-Baró talks about this. He talks about these paradoxical moments, how in the most horrific of circumstances, when people experience their own resiliency or experience their own capacity, she learned how to teach her children, which was the only education they had for many years. Not too many of the women did talk about these things. So this drawing was done by the Chu women from group 2, and what they did was very innovative. They took one piece of paper, they said, we're going to put the past and the present together because we still live in what they called an ever past present. That is, the past doesn't go away, even with the multiple workshops that we've been in, the attention that we've gotten, the many resources that have been given to us. But we have changed. So one woman writes, I am capable of doing all that I can. I am like a bird that I can fly with large wings. And so the birds represent how they experience themselves now, which is a really critical piece of that process. Then here's a drawing from another group of women, the Mon women. And this is a drawing in which they were asked to talk about their experiences now as women. And the way we do this technique is a small group does a drawing, and then the small group presents a drawing to the whole group and says, what do you all see? So I'm going to ask you guys, those of you who can see this from where you're sitting, what do you see? Anybody? If you don't speak Spanish, this says discrimination, organization, leadership, the road, communication, and this is the learnings of the group, of the Mom group. Anybody notice anything? What do you think that figure up at the right is representing?
It's a man.
It's a man?
It's a man.
Yeah, it looks like a man. What kind of man?
Because it's a man because he's too big.
Okay, he's really big. It's a big man.
But
And
they
so,
need to draw it.
who might the man stand for? What might the man stand for?
You know, it's to the woman.
Anybody? What
Round
would
the
the-
country.
He looks like a soldier.
It looks like a soldier. He might represent the military. Anybody else? What these women coming out of these experiences might be wanting to represent? We were all on that track. Man, soldier, authoritarian figure. Guess who they said that was? Us. Those are the intermediaries. Those are the people who come from Canada, the United States, and Guatemala City. And look how they represent us. We think we're facilitating collaborative workshops where we're all sitting around enjoying some kind of equity, deconstructing our power. But that's how they experience us. This is really, really important for us to hear, for us to understand, for us to take in, and not to respond defensively, but to understand that it's also related to a lot of anxiety because these particular women, now I didn't see this up in Chahul because there wasn't a lot of money attached to the Chahul projects, and the project could take place and were being run by women in their villages through the help of the Martin-Baro Fund and a small grant, and they were running them themselves. But the projects that these 54 women were participating in were run by non-governmental organizations located in Guatemala. And the money comes from Canada, mostly Canada, a little bit from the United States, and the people with the resources come from Canada and the United States. So we have to think about, over time, are we really training the trainers of local communities with local resources so that they can take over this work? Or are we somehow replicating? We're certainly keeping ourselves employed because, you know, they need us and the grants pay for us to get there and the grants. So that's what I mean when I say we have to be reflexive, we have to think critically, we have to analyze. I'm not saying we shouldn't do this. I'm not prepared to take that position. So then we had to try and interpret from their knowledge the contributions of the creative arts and embodied practices. Well, one thing we saw was they talked about an enhanced self-esteem. You saw that in the bird ideas. Their responses to the experiences of violation and loss, and they could speak through the images. Many women talked about, I go to workshops and when all it is talk, I don't understand what people are saying, I don't speak the language and I can't say who I am. When I can draw, when I can act, when I can engage, I can communicate who I am, and we can talk to women who speak different languages. We can talk across that. That doesn't mean that trying to put words to things is not important, but it's a collaborative process. They very deeply valued being together, and they saw the group processes as resources for what they called sanación, or healing. They were able to thread and rethread community, and again, it's two different types of community, one that's geographically placed, and the other that's a community of women, and then they were able to tell their own stories and represent them outside themselves. There are also some differences. As I said, the role of intermediaries came up more in the second group than in the first. This notion of the ever-present past, and also the second group was slightly higher educated. They used a lot of words on their pictures and didn't just limit them to pictures. And so they give us some way of I mean, it's kind of highfalutin to call it re-theorizing trauma, but rethinking, or sort of ways of how to think about this from the base. That these women, despite the fact that the war is technically speaking over, it ended in 1996 with the peace accord signature, there's ongoing violence and they continue to live in situations of normal abnormality. Again, Martin-Baro meant by that things that you think of as abnormal, that is that your kid disappears on its way to school, or that your husband doesn't come home from work at the end of the day, which of course happens to undocumented migrants here in the United States. That's abnormal. That shouldn't be happening every day, but that's normalized in a war, conflict, or a context of ongoing violence. That one carries it in one's bodies, and that by performing these experiences, there are possibilities of personal transformation, and at least the potential for rethreading community, for people reconnecting to each other. Many women in Chapu talked about the project as having allowed them to hear the stories of people that they live next door to, but never dared to ask about what their experiences have been during close to 30 years of armed conflict. Because it was too scary, it was too much of a threat. Fear and anxiety are momentarily within these workshops risked and enacted through performances where people can actually show anger at who plays the role of the perpetrator. And they can experience these feelings in ways that they've never been allowed to perform them or express them before. And they can even laugh at something that's unlaughable and connect to their possibilities of resisting ongoing fear. And then there's also a growing recognition that participants play with the forces that constrain and oppress them and gain a little bit of direct relief and control over their situations, and envision participating in a much wider context. And that wider context for the women in Chapu was that book, and for the other group I'll show you in a minute. Now I want to take up sort of three sets of issues that are problematic in this work that I think we need to think about. Not because I think it undermines the work, but because I think it's something that one needs to think about if one's going to think about doing this kind of work. One is something that Holcomb said, and that has been taken up in a very provocative book called The Tyranny of Participation. And it's a set of themes that we see in the development community, but it's really an important set of themes for psychologists and social scientists more generally to think about. That participation and, in his word, empowerment do not just happen. There has to be a strategy and a set of actions to allow them to develop. And that's a lot of what I brought into the context, is a set of resources and techniques that I learned in other places, whether it was drama, whether it was storytelling, whether it was, and those set up a certain set of norms. So just a really quick example. So in Mayan communities, especially rural communities, even with the onset of more universal access to education, at least through the 6th grade, there is, in many rural communities, deep respect for the elderly. And women have a deep respect for men. And so who can speak in a particular context and whose talk is more valued are norms that fit the cultural experiences and traditions. Well, in the workshops that I run, everybody can speak, and everybody's invited to participate, and everybody's words are urged to be taken equally seriously. So there's a tension between that set of realities and a more traditional set of realities. So Andrea Cornwall, who's a development worker in England, says, so what happens when you work in a traditional community and you only work with women, which I can be accused of having done, and women begin to get their voices, but they go home and they try and exercise those voices in their homes with their husbands who have bought into the process enough to allow them to come to the meetings because they've asked for permission, and we had to do that, go door to door to ask for permission. But they haven't bought into it in the same way that the women have learned how to voice. Well, often the woman gets beaten. So then have I facilitated a process whereby a woman's power can only be exercised in a particular context? And how do we work with this set of issues? This process, we got a small grant to run these workshops, so the women thought, well, in order to, we have to turn in an account every month to the funder, right? So we have to say how many people came to the workshop. So unless you've worked in rural Guatemala or in a war zone and with people who are not literate, you wouldn't know what that is. But it's people putting their thumbprints on a piece of paper to say they've been in the workshop, right? Because they can't write their names. That's exactly the technique that the military used during the war to control the population. So that was a technique used to oppress people, and they have rethreaded it into their own technique. So it raises interesting questions about sort of how does change happen, what changes and what doesn't change, and what kinds of processes does one develop. It also raises interesting questions about literacy, and I, unlike my colleagues in Guatemala, thought that we could have all women with, it didn't matter what levels of literacy they had or didn't have, and the women themselves said, are you out of your mind? We have to have a few people who know how to write. And they were right, of course. You can't do a workshop and a series of things where you're going to generate a book and have no one in the group who knows how to write, and write in the language of the people that are living it. I also think this raises very interesting questions about the term empowerment. People who have studied with me know I don't like this term because it's a term that suggests in some way that I give power to someone else, and I think what these workshops are about is power circulates in all kinds of ways in all kinds of places, and everybody's got power, and lots of people don't have power for different structural reasons. But what this work is about women repositioning themselves as protagonists at the intersection of the community of women and indigenous community. And so it suggests that we need to turn this idea of the notion of empowering women makes power a transferable commodity rather than a structural relationship. So Cornwall says we have to think of the structures of power and how we renegotiate empowerment as a term, a goal, and a process. And more recently, Ivan, a sociologist, has suggested that we need to extend this idea and think about, if we're going to use the term, what about cultural empowerment? What about collective empowerment? What about liberating empowerment? What about pleasurable empowerment? That's important. Pleasurable empowerment. And then, and this has been a really difficult lesson for us, and that is that in this project with Alison Crosby, we're trying to look at women's understandings of reparation and what they think would restore in any way, shape, or form, or heal them in some way. Truth and reconciliation processes that are facilitated in post-conflict situations talk a lot about testimony, telling truth, and about seeking justice. And some of these women are very goal-focused on seeking justice. There's a small group that's bringing the case between the courts, and we did a tribunal of conscience. But mostly what we hear over and over again is the extreme poverty that gave rise to the war continues to be an extreme poverty in the ongoing context in which these women are living their lives. And so I think those of us who are human rights activists or who locate our work within the human rights domain have to think really hard about social and economic rights and how they fit into this press for human rights that has emerged in these transitional justice mechanisms. There are economic distributions that are made to people who qualify as survivors of gross violations of human rights. They aren't enough to let you survive for 6 months, much less a year or 10 years. Women lost their spouses, they themselves were raped horribly, they gave birth to children that they've had to raise in the midst of stigma and all kinds of, and they constantly talk about this legacy. The other thing is that another piece that's emerged in the context, and this is a contribution from the international human rights community, is this recognition of family violence. That was not a topic that anybody ever talked about openly 20 years ago in rural Guatemala. And people do see the connections and make the connections. It's very challenging to figure out what to do about it, particularly in rural communities where there are absolutely no resources of any fashion. I'm going to skip over this, but those are the challenges for the intermediaries in order to just raise a couple of last ideas about the limits of liberation psychology and participatory action research. So this idea is that women can name impoverishment as a central violation, but then human mental health is a part of economic development, and the corn mill is a mental health project. And so material transformations are core to reparations. So what does that mean for those of us who are psychologists? What do we do? How do we engage? How do we work with? And then secondly, I think there's a strong sense that we need to resist constructing survivor narratives with static categories of culture, trauma, victim, survivor, because they end up objectifying suffering and the sufferer. And we need rather to embrace what I'm going to call something that is a mouthful, but people's psychosocial practice. That is, how do people on the ground themselves live out their responses to these realities? And when, on the rare moment, they invite somebody like me into the context, it's to watch. It's to help them with a few small resources so they can generate what are their potentialities and possibilities for a longer-term survival. This is a really hard lesson. It's much easier to swallow this lesson when you're on the latter half of your career than when you're on the former half of your career. It doesn't mean you don't need to learn all the things that your career provides for you, but it does mean you have to think about how do you position yourself in this process. And so for me, we need to position ourselves in terms of our privilege. We need to be constantly about undoing racism in all of the different environments in which we find ourselves. And we need to interrogate our own internalized superiority, because that gets communicated in all kinds of ways and all kinds of contexts. And it's only if we do that that we'll be able to develop just enough trust and be able to work on analyzing power and developing consciousness. And that allows other people's stories to emerge. And then when we're lucky, that allows us to take action in other people's stories. So from Ignacio Martín-Baró, I think we're challenged to de-ideologize the official stories perpetrated by our governments and our economic elites. We're challenged to denounce what have become the economic chasms separating the rich and the poor and the hyper-wealthy 1% in this country. We're challenged to undo institutionalized racism, whereby brown and black bodies are more likely to be deported, incarcerated, or killed when they gain entry into higher education, and to deconstruct the militarization of everyday life, its anti-terrorist rhetoric, and the erosion of what were previously cherished civil liberties. And that translates to some incredible responses that are going on throughout the world. There are Latin American institutes, courses on liberation theology, psychology, in Venezuela, Colombia, Chile, El Salvador, and beyond. There's a huge liberation social psychology conference. The next one's going to be in July in El Salvador. There's an English language website that a guy named Burton, who does wonderful work, has really offered his time to generate this, and because a lot of this work is in Spanish. And then you heard a little bit about the Ignacio Martín-Baró Fund, which not only does grant making and education, but has been involved in petitioning the American Psychological Association not to allow psychologists to participate in interrogations in Guantanamo, Abu Ghraib, and other places. And those challenges are really, I think, what the work of Ignacio Martín-Baró means for us today. That is, we as psychologists have to turn our discipline to challenging these implicit messages. And I want to end, I can't find an exact quote, but I had the good fortune of tripping over Martin Luther King's address to the American Psychological Association. shortly before he was assassinated. And it's I strongly recommend you read it. Some of you may have actually been there. He did it delivered in 1st of September. It's a strong and critical challenge to psychology to use our discipline to critique our own internalization of white privilege, to undo systems of hegemony that characterized the United States in the 1960s, and I would argue continue to characterize the United States today, and to then put our resources at the disposition of communities of color, particularly African American communities, who want to understand their realities and liberate themselves. So thank you very much, and I'm open to questions. Yes.
Before questions, there are some surveys going around. If you need to leave, just drop them off in the basket in the back, and you will get a chance to sign in and sign in sheets up here in the front.
Comments, reactions, questions, additions, subtractions. Yes.
I have sort of a practical or kind of key question when I was thinking about the creative modes that you've used in working with these women. Did you have an expertise in sort of constructing those kind of groups or co-constructing, or did you bring in folks who are experts in sort of creative expression?
It's a really good question. Thank you. Two answers to that. One is I strongly urge you never to do anything like that until you've been a participant in a workshop where you yourself have done the exercise. That is, don't ever ask somebody else to do something that you yourself haven't done. Secondly, a little bit of an autobiographical insertion. I was educated from my neck up. That is, I learned how to think and talk, yakety-yakety-yak, when I was going through elementary school, high school, etc. And I was afraid of my body. My mother made me take a ballet class for a while, and I was lucky I landed in the hospital shortly in the middle of it, and I never had to do that again. But when I started working in Guatemala, and I started listening to, this was during the armed conflict, and I started listening to stories and documenting stories that kids were telling. And then I came back to the United States and I started transcribing them. I had two polarized reactions to it. One was I was completely devastated and I just cried. And the other was I was enraged and I just wanted to kill somebody, which is a really bad impulse, and I didn't. And around that time, I had met some people at a conference in Cuba from Argentina, and they were working with theater and with creative techniques with the children that had disappeared. And I was invited to spend some time down there working. We set up an international mental health and human rights network with Ignacio Martín-Baró, and I was invited to spend 6 months down there. And I had a very unusual experience at the beginning of those 6 months, and that drove me to ask to join a psychoanalytic psychodrama training program, which I did for 6 months. And worked, then the first time I ever worked in Guatemala, I worked with a guy who was trained in theater and part of mental health and human rights movement. And so for the first 3 years, it was before I worked with these women, it was working for a rural health program. We worked collaboratively, so I had a lot of people who knew a lot about having these techniques. And over time then, I sort of introduced some that I learned through psychology. But yes, it was critically important to have that training, and quite honestly, I think I would have never been mobilized to do such a thing if it hadn't been in another language. But somehow, learning it in Spanish gave me some kind of freedom that I didn't have doing it up here in English. Another comment, question. But the reason to do it yourself before you ask other people to do it is to sort of know what it feels like, to know what happens in you when you engage a part of yourself that hasn't been engaged before, mobilized before, and also your own anxieties. This whole thing of I don't know how to draw, which is a real thing that, you know, it's knocked out of you in U.S. education. You might have learned something about drawing when you were in first grade. Then somewhere along the way someone said, ooh, that's not what a dog really looks like. And little by little you internalize this notion that you do know how to draw. So a lot of times in group processes, when you ask a group to draw something, who knows how to draw? That's the first question that the group asks. And one person's given all the crayons or the markers or whatever, etc. Well, many people are listening there. That might be universal. Oh, scary. Yes?
I see here in 1989, solidarity and the admiration for you. We must be very proud that the fire is still alive from 1989 to 2010.
She was a sweetheart. Yeah, I
Yes.
had the good
I
pleasure.
can see,
I
yeah.
didn't realize it was in there.
Yes,
But we
yes.
stayed in my house for
Yes.
a few weeks when we came to Boston.
So my comment is that in the 4th century, I am a theologian and systematic theology. In the 4th century, I admired Ambrose. In the 4th century, St. Ambrose says, institutional terrorism is the one who produced subversive terrorism. And we see it today. We are the cause here. The roots are here in the fire. There's no one place in the planet Earth does not have a drop of blood of American war. It's not. From the Middle East, this. Y yo lo voy a decir en español. Se apedrean las árboles que dan frutos. We are in need of all the third world to survive. We cannot eat breakfast without them.
Absolutely, and if you drive through Brookline right now, I noticed when I was coming from the dentist this morning, they have all of these banners, the 50th anniversary of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and one of them is, we don't stop war, war will stop us. So it's a more modern articulation of what you're talking about, but thank you for that Ambrose connection. I'm too far away from my studies of philosophy to remember. Other comments, reactions, questions, thoughts, anxieties? Yes?
I was thinking about when you were talking about normal abnormality, applied to war context and political context, things that are happening shouldn't happen. How also extreme poverty in rural zones and in urban zones also can also be seen as normal abnormalities. So it's not only in a war context, but in our daily lives that we see normal abnormalities.
I think that's a really important point, and I think unfortunately I think we construct blinders, right, so that we don't see it, rather than stop, pause, and wonder what can we do to redress that reality. And I think that in a world that has become so permeated by communication, where we are made so very much aware of what's going on in so many different parts of the world, for many of us, it causes us to shut it down rather than to take it in, because we can't think about how I can do anything around it. And I think that what the opportunity to accompany some of these communities has helped me to see is that a tiny little drop in the ocean does make a difference. That an individual life, for the most part, there are a few lives that are not. And I resist turning Martin-Baro into a saint, or resist turning him into a martyr, because I think it puts him on a pedestal and he says he's not one of us. No, he was one of us. Every day he got up and made a choice about how he was going to spend his time in the day. And that's the most that we can do. And a few of us end up, because of a convergence of forces, in leadership positions where we might make a little bit more of a difference in the world. But no, most of us have an opportunity to get up every day and make a choice, or maybe two, how we're going to live the day. And that's, I guess when you work with people whose lives are daily on the margins, I think of Marianne working with people on islands that are disappearing. They get up in the morning and they put one foot roughly in front of the other, and they, figure out how to make a difference in that world and in that life. And we have the opportunity to collaborate and contribute to that process. Yes?
Yeah, it shows that big change that's very powerful in the intermediary roles. So what do you do in your work? What do you do in this field work to change the power dynamics between the intermediaries and the community?
That's a really important question. Well, I can talk about it a little more effectively and efficiently in Chahul than I can in the work with the more recent work with Unam He. Because in fact, that was Unam He, it wasn't really us. It was the local Guatemalan Ladino population. And I'm in a very tricky position to comment about that because there is now in Guatemala a group of professionals who have the skills and capacities to do a lot of this work. Yet they are very much outside of the Mayan indigenous rural communities, and it's very complicated to negotiate that power, and as an outsider, I'm sometimes taken off the hook in ways that I wasn't 20 years ago when the U.S. was sending millions of dollars down to drop bombs on people's heads. In Chahul, how we do it is in a variety of ways. One is that I work with people who speak Ixil and Quiche, and I'm not proud of the fact that I studied Quiche for numbers of years and could carry on a hello, how are you conversation, but I can't even do that in Ixil. And Ricardo Faya, who's a good friend and a colleague and an anthropologist, she criticizes me on a regular basis. How could I work in a community for as many years as I have and not speak their language? But I actually think it's a democratizing process, because they can have a conversation that they can exclude me from super easily, and they do it on a regular basis. And that is a way of power shifting. It's a way in which local people say, we know we're in charge of this process, and we're letting you be here as a part of this process. The second, and again, not something I would have chosen, is I've watched them manipulate me to make a decision that they didn't want to take what I thought into consideration. And I hated the experience actually going through it. I was miserable. I went to my friend's house in Guatemala City and I cried. And she looked at me and laughed and said, you're the one who talks about redistributing power, and here they are. They're exercising their power. You don't like what they've decided. And so you're upset because they marginalized you from the decision-making process. So one thing I do is that we spend a lot of time with women learning how to facilitate workshops themselves. And that's made a huge difference. The women from the project, in the Photo Voice project, now run workshops in more rural villages that they themselves run. And then every once in a while they invite me up and they say, come do something for us. Rocio was up there this summer and we did something together in one of the villages. But we do it on their terms, based on what they want to have happen. One of the things they've done that really changed these workshops a lot is they brought a lot more of Mayan storytelling into it. So they generated a lot of exercises which are based on traditional stories that have to do with the role of a bee, for example, and or the role of an ant. And so bees and ants become protagonists in the stories in ways that I actually didn't know enough about these stories to have been able to integrate into them. And so they facilitate processes, and I watch and I learn how they facilitate them. The whole introduction of Mayan religious activities at the beginning of a workshop, I mean, I've watched Westerners inject this into workshops. It's quite different when Mayan communities themselves do it. Up in Chahul, they're very anxious about the sectarianism up there, the evangelical Christians, the Catholics, and the Mayanists. So they start their workshops with who would like to bring something from their religious tradition into the mix. I have never done that before. I have deeply limited tolerance for evangelical Christianity, I humbly confess. But they're right. That's the way they should be doing these things, not imposing, one or another religious tradition. So, I mean, I think we deconstruct the power, we talk about, and another thing that's happened, which I have been, roundly criticized for by Ladino women in the capital. I invite Mayan women from Chahul. When I'm invited to give a lecture in Guatemala, I invite them down to Guatemala City to talk about the work we do together, rather than me doing the piece. I brought them to Boston College, they toured the United States. I'm criticized because one can look at that and say that's the exoticization of the Mayan, and it's sort of putting them on the spot, and it's acting as if they're somehow different than all the other people they live with. For me, it's an opportunity to say, you know what, this is their work that I was a part of. But when they came to the United States and they stayed in my house, I was super anxious. I thought, what are they going to think? I live in a house. And I thought, oh God, they already know that I'm wealth and their poverty. But so what did they say to me about my house? They said, oh, you poor dear, you don't have any land. Because I live in Jamaica Plain, but the house is right next to me. And then they said to me, why is it that every place you've taken us since we got here, is unrelated people living together. Don't you all get married and have your own children? And I thought, gee, it never would have occurred to me that those, and they were right, you know, I live in this setup where we're not married with our own children, and also I took them to a lot of places where. So what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we've completely deconstructed power, but it does mean that over time, relationships, but then there are lots of things that they've seen and learned through these travels. Some of them came to South Africa, etc., where they don't approve, you know? They don't approve of many things they've seen and heard, and so their lives are challenged also by these encounters. But it's a very difficult, you know, I mean, I think when it was the war and I was the only one who could speak without threats to other people, it was easy to give talks. Now it's different, because they can speak. Anyone else? Kiki.
I'm sorry, I'm like recovering from a cold. I'm wondering how you can apply this term of normal abnormalities when working with first generation and second generation immigrants here in the US. Because I'm working with both authorized and non-authorized immigrants, and what's pathological for me in like working with the children for their mothers is something they seen when like where they grew up, or they were victims of trauma, like growing up in El Salvador, Puerto Rico, I don't know, any like rural areas. So working with children and trying to like make it something, like making a balance and not saying to their parents or to their mother usually, oh, this is what's happening to your son, and into their eyes it's just, oh, that's nothing, or making it not be pathological, but something that should be worrying, and a way we can intervene without making it stigmatizing.
Yeah, I think it's a very important question you're asking, and it's super challenging when one works in one-on-one relationships with people. My sense of these issues is that, and I know the time is up, so this will be the last question, and we'll end and then have informal conversations. But my sense is that to in whatever way is possible, to try and understand how the mother makes meaning of what is going on. That is, what is her story about what she sees or doesn't see? How does she understand these issues? I think it's super hard to communicate to anybody, whether you're an unauthorized migrant or you know, you've lived here all your life, is sort of, you know, whether you have a sense of my child is perfect or you have a sense of my child is imperfect. It's very hard to communicate a particular kind of problem in a particular kind of context, but it's trying to understand these intergenerational experiences and trying to understand. I mean, one of the things we found in the workshop, in the research we've been doing with migrants here is, and you know, it's easiest to talk about in terms of these workplace raids that many unauthorized migrants have experienced is when those helicopters whirl overhead, people who've come from war zones in Salvador and Guatemala, Honduras, their first thought is, there's a bomb that's going to drop on my head. It's not. It's the U.S. authority who's trying to, you know, manage the laws. And then when they get handcuffed and arrested and handed over to immigration, so what people say about those experiences is it's a second war to me. You know, those are the quotes that we get from people. And I think we owe it to our authorities to try and explain this to U.S. authorities, that the strategies we use are terrorizing people as opposed to, you know, it's not quite the same thing, although I do think it's kind of the same thing, particularly if we have one more Trayvon Martin experience, which some people are saying, which is out another one in Detroit, is that African Americans in, you know, in urban communities experience it not too differently, to go back to Gabriella's earlier point about normal abnormality in this country. So I think the one-on-one communication is very different than the group communication. I do think, you know, to the extent to which one can organize opportunities for unauthorized migrants to meet together there's a lot of organizations in the greater Boston area, and where they can encounter some of these stories together, and where, you know, you as a counseling psychologist could facilitate a group with some of these or other exercises. I think it's much easier for people to embrace some of these difficult issues. Thank you all very much, and please learn about the Martin-Baro Fund. It's a very tiny way in which you can participate in supporting some of this work. And Kiki is a great organizer, so she can tell you a lot about it.